Hello, welcome to Big Picture Monday. My name is Cali Black, and I'm here to tell you the story version of what's going on in this week's Come Follow Me reading, so that as you read, you can focus on the spiritual applications instead of having to worry so much about the background context, because I'm going to fill you in on all the details right now. And I do hope that these videos encourage you to get in the scriptures. I had some great conversations this past week with people about the temptation sometimes. There's so many great supplemental resources out there, and I feel grateful that you're even watching mine as one of them, that sometimes it's tempting to want to replace our scripture study with the supplemental materials. And I just hope that my materials encourage you to then get in the scriptures. I hope they're helpful. But at the end of the day, nothing, I strongly believe this, can replace opening up the scriptures yourself and reading. And I hope watching these videos before you read makes that even more meaningful, because you don't have to worry about what's going on. Instead, you get that inspiration. So just as a reminder, I hope that these inspire you to get in the scriptures, because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about. The scriptures have more spiritual power in them than I think we even realize. Okay, this week we get to study Esther. Yes, look, my sidekick is so excited. The book of Esther. There are 10 chapters. We're studying all 10 of them, but honestly, they're pretty short. This is also an amazing story, so it's worth it to read anything that you can to learn about the story of Esther. This is the last book that we study in the historical books section of the Bible. You made it! Congratulations! Remember the first chunk, there's 4 chunks, 4 little divisions in the Bible. The first one were the books of Moses, meaning Moses wrote those books. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Okay, those 5 books, we already studied those for the first part of the year. Now, ever since the book of Joshua, we've been in these historical books, and I feel like you've got the gist of it now. There's a lot of history going on, a lot of things happening, and also clearly the authors are wanting to show that the history and what civilizations are doing is affected by how much they turn to God or not, right? And last week we studied the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which both occurred after all of southern Judah had been conquered and taken away into Babylon. And then we learned that Persia conquered Babylon, right? So now, even though it's the same land as Babylon was, we now call it Persia, and we have Persian kings that are ruling over the land. Same place though, right? Last week we talked about how different groups were allowed to go back to Jerusalem. So to give some context of when Esther's story takes place, at the beginning of the book of Ezra, Ezra writes about a previous group that was allowed to go back. Okay, it was King Cyrus who allowed them to go back. And then while they were out there was a new king, King Darius, who wrote people and was like, hey, get out of the Jews' way and let them build their temple, okay? So King Darius was like supporting these people. Well, King Darius's son is King Ahasuerus, and that is the king in Esther's story. Now, King Ahasuerus' son is the king that then tells Ezra and Nehemiah that they can go back to Jerusalem as well. So Esther's story takes place in the middle of the book of Ezra and before the book of Nehemiah. Remember how Ezra had that big time jump in the middle? Esther's story takes place in the middle there. So that's why I was saying last week was the end of the story of the Bible, because it really was. Esther's story takes place in the middle of that. And it takes place in Persia. So we're not in Jerusalem. We're not worrying about the temple. That's all happening separately than this story right here. Now, one more piece of context that I think might be helpful, because I've always been confused when I learn about Esther's story, and I'm like, why does it seem like the king doesn't know that there are Jews in the land or who the Jews even are? It's always seemed strange to me. I don't know if anyone can relate to that, but here's what I've learned, and now it makes much more sense. The Jews had only been brought into captivity in Persia a couple generations beforehand, and it's not like the Persians were like, hey, we've captured Babylon, who had just conquered Jerusalem, so now we have the Babylonians with some Jews. That is not what it was like. In fact, it was the Persians conquering a whole bunch of different lands. They were conquering everyone at the same time. So yeah, we conquered Babylon too. And then Babylon itself had been conquering a bunch of lands too. So the Jews were not like this very known subgroup of like, yes, we've conquered them and here they are. Instead, it was like kind of this melting pot of a bunch of different people that had been captured from different places and taken out of their places. And now the Persians are in here and they don't really know who they're ruling over. They're just like, hey, we conquered you, now we're in charge. So I don't know if that helps, but it wasn't so black and white of like, yes, we've conquered the Babylonians who had conquered the Jews. Instead, it was, we don't know who we're getting. Let's just start ruling and making things happen. Okay, so hopefully that sets the scene a little bit better for Esther's story to make sense. Okay, let's dive in to the book of Esther, the last of our historical books. Chapter 1, we have King Ahasuerus. He's the king. He's hosting this big feast. And at the same time that he's hosting this big feast, his wife, who is Queen Vashti, she's holding her own feast. And at one point, the king invites the queen to come and parade herself in front of all of the princes. And Vashti refuses to do this. And the king brings up this issue to his princes and says, what do I do? And the princes say, if your wife thinks that she can say no to you and word gets out that this happens, imagine what every other wife will do to their husband. They might say no to their husbands too throughout the land. And so the king says, okay, I'm going to remove Vashti as the queen. And so he removes her as the queen. So in chapter 2, the king announces that he's looking for a new queen. Now we learn about someone named Mordecai. Mordecai is a man who goes to Esther. Esther is his cousin. I'll explain that in a second. Goes to Esther, his cousin, and says, you need to go and try and be the new queen. But don't let him know that you're a Jew. Like, just don't reveal anything about your heritage. I don't know who would be asking that question anyways, but like, make sure they don't know that you are of Jewish heritage. And so Esther says, okay. And she goes into the gates of the palace. And while she's in the gates of the palace, Mordecai is waiting outside. He wants to know what's happening, right? It's not like Esther can just like text him and be like, all right, leaving the room now or whatever. So Mordecai wants to know what's going on, and he's waiting and he's waiting and he's trying to hear what's going on. And basically that's like a beauty pageant for the king to pick the most beautiful woman. And he picks Esther. He picks Esther to become his wife. And Mordecai is still outside waiting to hear what's going on. And while he's out there, he hears two guards who are plotting to kill the king. And Mordecai's like, that's not good. So he tells someone who makes sure Esther knows, and Esther tells the king, hey, Mordecai told me that this is going to happen. This guy named Mordecai told me this. And the king is able to foil the plan and put those two servants to death. Okay, so now we've got Esther's the queen. Mordecai just saved the king's life by informing him of what he had heard outside of the walls. Okay, chapter 3, we have a new character named Haman. Haman is just newly appointed to a very high position in the king's court, and he is so proud of that position. He comes out from the palace and he insists that everyone bow to him. But Mordecai is out there and he makes it clear that he is not going to bow to Haman. In fact, Mordecai has made it very clear that he is a Jew, which means he worships the God of Israel. He worships a God and not any man, and he's not going to bow down to Haman. Haman is so offended and frustrated and angry at Haman that he makes a resolve to have all of these Jews killed, because that's what he learns Mordecai's a Jew. I'm going to have all the Jews killed because I can't have any group of people out there who thinks that they can't respect me as a leader. Now, his plan is he goes to the king and he presents this really vague but exaggerated plan to the king, saying, I need to get rid of this group of people. There's this group of people who will not worship you as a king. They won't respect me. They're going to be very defiant. We need to get rid of them right now. And the king's just kind of like, all right, Haman, do whatever you want. You have my permission. I trust you. Here's my little seal of approval. Go print out, go write out and send out the letters that you need to do. And that's what Haman does. he sends out a proclamation to all of the lands all throughout Persia. This is a huge area, so it has to be translated and sent, like huge logistical nightmare to get any sort of proclamation out, but Haman makes it happen. And it says that on a certain day, all of the Jews are going to be put to death. That's the proclamation. Okay, so chapter 4, Mordecai sees this proclamation, and along with the rest of the Jews that Mordecai is associated with, and of course, they're absolutely distraught. Mordecai goes back to the king's palace and is out there mourning. And one of Esther's servants sees Mordecai mourning and is like, Esther, Mordecai is out there and he's really upset about something. And this servant kind of becomes the back and forth between Esther and Mordecai. And Esther says, okay, go see what's going on. And Mordecai says, have you seen this proclamation? Where all the Jews are going to be put to death. And that would technically include you, although I don't think the king knows that you're included in this. And so Esther says, oh my goodness, what do you think we should do? Mordecai says, you need to go to the king and ask him to stop this proclamation from happening. And Esther says, oh, you don't understand. I can't just go to the king. If I'm not invited, the king can have me put to death. I can't just approach him in his inner chamber. Like, the king can have me put to death if it's not the right time for him to be approached by anyone. And Mordecai says, listen, what if this is the reason that you became the queen? Like, we need your help and this is what you need to do. And Esther says, okay, if you fast for 3 days along with the rest of the Jews and I'll join with you, then I will go in to the king and see what I can do about this proclamation. Okay, so chapter 5, Esther goes into the king in his inner chamber after the Jews have fasted for 3 days, and he allows it to happen. So Esther's life is spared at this point. And the king is there with Haman, and Esther requests that the king and Haman join her at a feast that she's going to produce for them. Haman, and the king says, okay. Haman leaves the palace feeling on cloud 9 because he just got invited to an exclusive feast with the queen. He's feeling really good about himself. And as he goes outside the palace, guess who's still there? Mordecai. Guess who still won't bow down and worship him? Mordecai. So he goes home to his wife and tells her, look, I'm so glad that I, got invited to this feast. And there's still a problem because Mordecai still won't bow down to me, and this is driving me insane. And his wife says, well, why don't you build a gallows to hang Mordecai on? And then when you go and talk to the king tomorrow, ask him permission to hang Mordecai for not listening to you. And Haman's like, oh yeah, sounds like a good plan. So he builds gallows meant to hang Mordecai. Chapter 6, that night, the king himself cannot sleep. And while he can't sleep, he decides to open up some old records, and he's reading through old records, and he finds out that this is Mordecai, is the guy, sitting in front of the palace, is the one who saved his life, the one who foiled that plan from those 2 servants earlier. He's like, oh my goodness, I never thanked this person who saved my life. I never gave him a reward. So Haman comes into work the next day at the palace, and the king says to Haman, hey, Haman, what would you do to reward someone for just being amazing and for saving your life and being so loyal and true? And Haman's like, oh, what would I do for that type of person? I would give them lots of rewards and riches, and I would parade them around the city. And in the ultimate plot twist, the king says, great. Haman, can you go find this guy outside? His name is Mordecai, and can you do all of that for him? And Haman does. He gives Mordecai the presents, and he parades Mordecai around the city, all while Mordecai is receiving great amount of praise. Haman goes home completely embarrassed that evening, completely embarrassed, and he talks to his wife again about this, that he can't believe that this happened. Now Haman goes back to the palace. He's ready for the feast. Chapter 7, the feast happens. Now the king seems to be anticipating that Esther's going to bring up something. Like, she's clearly throwing this feast for a reason. So the king's like, all right, Esther, we're at the feast. What's up? And Esther reveals, hey, my lineage is that I'm actually a Jew. And did you know that Haman just put out a proclamation to have all the Jews in the land put to death? And Haman immediately realizes what's going on. And the king, he seems to get like so frustrated he can't even respond. He leaves the palace, or he goes out on a balcony for a bit. He leaves the room, and Haman immediately comes to Esther and starts begging for mercy. Like, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize that would affect you and your people. I apologize. But while he's falling over her asking for mercy, the king comes back in and sees basically what looks like Haman attacking Esther, and Haman is immediately put to death, and he is hung on the gallows that Haman himself had built for Mordecai. I hope you're enjoying our background chatter from my little 3-month-old right now. Okay, chapter 8. Mordecai is then promoted to take Haman's job. And the king greatly trusts Mordecai. And the problem is, this proclamation is still out here. The date is approaching, and all the Jews are going to be killed on this particular day. And so Esther and Mordecai and the king are trying to figure it out. And some of us might think, well, can't the king just say, no, don't? Couple things here. First of all, there was a rule saying that kings couldn't just take back any official proclamation. If something went out as an official proclamation, nothing could change that. But secondly, the logistics of getting a new message out were really overwhelming. And since they couldn't take it back, what was this new message going to be? Well, Mordecai comes with a plan, and he says, why don't we say that the Jews are allowed to defend themselves on this day? It's not that they're put to death, but like, okay, you can try and get them, I guess, but Jews, you can fight back. You can, stand your ground, and you can insist that people leave you alone, pretty much. And the king says, you know what, I trust that. Here's my seal of approval. Let's get this put out. So again, it gets translated. All the logistics happen. This message gets sent out to everyone. Okay, chapter 9. Here we go. We're almost at the end. The day comes, and everything turns out pretty well. Now, I have to say, it looks like most people, when they saw that second proclamation of like, sure, the Jews can be put to death that day, but they can fight back, most people stood down. Most people who were ready to like put them to death, the other guards in different areas throughout Persia, most people stood down and were like, okay, we understand what this means. Don't kill the Jews. But it does sound like in some areas the Jews did have to defend themselves and fight for their lives. And they were so joyous that Mordecai was there to give them that proclamation. And they acted with such great faith in their gratitude, and they were able to stand their ground and save their own lives. It does look like, though, they were able to kill Haman's 10 sons. And then Mordecai is just celebrated. I mean, he saved all the Jews with his quick thinking as well. Chapter 10 is a very quick one at the very end. And it's just that the king is ruling with greatness and power in the future, and Mordecai becomes a great leader to all the Persians, but especially to the Jews as well, and kind of puts him up on a pedestal that he did great things for the people as well. Okay, that's the story of Esther, all 10 chapters. It's probably a familiar story, although I think some of those details hopefully helped clear some things up. And also some of that perspective of, oh, I see how this fits in with the captivity of the Jews. This makes a lot more sense now, especially why the king wasn't aware, or why Haman wasn't even aware that Esther could be Jewish and what that even meant. They were just kind of an unknown entity, just like I'm sure many other people were in this conglomerate mix-up of all sorts of different races and different cultures at the time. Okay, I think my personal focus question for this week is going to be about Haman. He let his anger and his pride lead to some terrible things. And so while I do not believe that my anger and pride is at the level of Haman's at this point, how can I still work to root that out? Because I do still have anger, and I do still have pride in my life. So how can I work to get rid of that anger and that pride, and instead learn to use kindness and humility? How can I add more kindness and humility in my life? Of course, I think the answer is turning to my Savior, Jesus Christ, but thinking about what that looks like specifically in my life right now, in my personal situation. Get rid of that anger and pride and replace it with kindness and humility. All right, have a great week this week studying the last of our historical books. Come back next week when we start on poetry. I'm so excited to jump into the next section in the Old Testament as well. Okay, have a great week and happy studying.